Hello everyone and welcome back to another book review. Today I am going to be reviewing Medieval Craftsmen, Scribes and Illuminators by Christopher De Hamel. The outside of this book is a plain red cover, so I'm showing you this inside flap. This was a short book that I read that kind of was encouraged by my recent reading kick I've been on medieval manuscripts, medieval art, and what can be contained in these manuscripts. I placed a hold on this one, not sure what to expect, and I felt like this book filled a niche in my reading that I haven't come across yet, and I think it did the job spectacularly. So I've read a lot of books about the art in medieval manuscripts, what the text in medieval manuscripts contains, bestiaries, necromancers' manuals, beasts, marine maps, but I haven't read a book that talks about how the manuscripts I'm looking at were actually compiled and put together. And that's where this book, Scribes and Illuminators by Christopher De Hamel, comes in. This book is a step-by-step manual about how these books in medieval times were put together, the materials, the craftsmen, the step-by-step process, the differences, and what we can glean from this process as modern investigators. The book is a little bit older. It was written in 1992. I'm going to be discussing what is in this book, what I liked about this book, and maybe some things to keep in mind considering the book is over 30 years old. The contents of this book is just 3 sections. There's an introduction, 3 broad sections that discuss manuscript creation, which I'm going to be going through, and then a glossary and further reading. There is plenty of pictures and art throughout this book, so there are some pages that are just art focused and some that are just text focused, and I think the balance was really, really good. The book is also under 100 pages, but it has condensed the information to just what you need to know, the perfect balance between just enough information, not too much, not too little. And that's a really hard spot, I think, sometimes to get. So I was really impressed with this book for managing that balance well. Section 1 is paper and parchment makers, 2, ink makers and scribes, and the 3rd section, illuminators, binders, and booksellers. So I'm going to go through each one of these sections and tell you what you can expect to read about in this in case you are considering getting this book. 1, paper and parchment makers. So this is down to the most fundamental level, what these books were written on. The author goes into the different types of materials that could be used, papyrus being the least stable, then parchment, which was made from animal skin, being very stable, and then the roll paper played. The creation process of all of this, particularly stuff coming out of China and Egypt, and the way that these skins of animals were prepared to make parchment. Each of these had different properties of holding ink, which was important as well. And another thing that was of interest, particularly around parchment, which was very popular, was the difference on whether the skin you were writing on was from the outside of the animal or the inside, and the different properties in that. I had never thought about that before, but that was a really interesting aspect for me to read about. Finally, this section concludes with lining a manuscript. So a lot of these manuscripts had lines underneath it. And unlike today, where I guess, according to the book, it's considered bad form to write letters on lined paper, it's considered best if you write these letters on freehand, no lined paper, which I didn't realize was a rule, a social etiquette rule. Back in medieval times, it was considered better to write on lined paper, so to manually line your manuscripts and then to write within the lines versus to write freehand, which was considered maybe more of a lower form of the writing art. So there were different instruments and tools you would use to line, and then you could also line up the pages across pages to make sure all your lines were even. So that was kind of the section that talked about the fundamentals, the creation of the paper or the parchment or whatever was going to be used, and then lining it, preparation to write whatever was going to be written on it. Section 2 is where we go into the ink makers and scribes. So we start with the ink. This is where we get to the writing. The ink came in 2 varieties. There was one that was popular in the early Middle Ages, and the one that once became developed was known to be superior. And they talk about the creation process of the ink. Let me get to the ink section. They also talk about the pens and the creation of these quill pens. It was actually interesting to note that the creation of the pens was so common and mundane that there isn't a lot written about it, that we kind of have to infer how these were created. We do know how the ink was created because there are different recipes that are shared, The section also talks about the color of the ink because different words would be written in different colors, and this was very important to the creation of a manuscript. And there are even sections quoted in this book where someone purchasing would request this be done in this color ink, this be done in this colored ink. So the color of the ink was also an important thing that needed to be discussed ahead of the creation of the manuscript. There was also a very interesting problem that you can imagine would come up, which is what to do about mistakes when writing. So there was a whole section then about the scribes who were actually writing, how they would copy these texts in the creative desks they would sit at. But when working all day, they would frequently make mistakes. A common one being eye skip, where you would write from a different or incorrect place in the manuscript from copying. You can imagine if your job as a scribe is to copy all day, you're going to make manuscripts. Mistakes. I just made one. You're going to make mistakes in the manuscript, and these are ones we can see, particularly when writing. Sometimes you could scrape it off with a pen. You'd kind of do some erasing work. Or if the thing had already dried, the ink had already dried, you could write different notes here, which would indicate the mistake, which was actually seen as a good sign to see those because it meant that the text had been very clearly checked. So these were not seen as negative. But there was also the interesting problem on what if the book was primarily for looks? It wasn't really about the text, such as very richly decorated Book of Hours, in which case they had a very unique idea to put like a little line or some dots underneath a word that was actually a mistake, maybe not supposed to be there, maybe duplicated, whatever. And that was an indication to the reader that that word was a mistake, but they didn't want to scrape it out with a pen or make some unsightly mark on the side that would ruin the visual appeal of the book. So there are different ways of working around mistakes. The whole section of this book, this whole section about scribes also talked about the economics of the scribes. So they would advertise their works, and one of the ways they would advertise would be giving a list of different scripts they could do, the different fonts almost that they could write in, and then they could advertise their wares to people who may want, or their services, I should say, not really wares, to people who may be interested in copying a book. So once the ink makers and scribes have done their work, it moves on to the third section, illumination, binders, booksellers. So this is the last stop. After everything's been written, we need to decorate the book. This is one of the favorites of people who read about medieval manuscripts, myself included. I love the little decorations. Illumination and working with gold is quite fancy. It looks very, very pretty. And also the book needs to be bound because it's written in small sections, and there are booksellers who are going to sell all of their works to people who need it. So that is the third section, which starts on page 45. Putting the book together was a task. It was written in small sections and all of them needed to be bound together. So this chapter discusses how the books were bound together and also the decoration. So there needed to be things drawn, and we can see connections between drawings in books. We can see that all of these people were copying from this template and all of these people were copying from this template. There were even books that told people how to draw things like leaves, and we can see in unfinished manuscripts, which are maybe the most interesting, the way that maybe different areas were marked with letters to tell someone who was going to be coloring the text or the illustration, which part of the illustration was going to be which color, which I had not heard of that before, and that was really interesting to see. The unfinished ones, you can see too, how they were set up to leave space. And here's a book showing how to draw the leaves. So there seemed to be a lot of instruction around this. The working with gold was another interesting section. We had these hammered out pieces of gold that were used for illumination, and the people who were working with them were quite delicate as they manipulated the pieces of gold onto the sheet to give a good shimmer and the illuminative quality of an illuminated manuscript. So I really enjoyed reading about that section and learning about how careful they had to be in applying the gold to the manuscript to get the effect that they wanted. Finally, there was a final form, and the book was ready to go out. You could mark it. Here's some old binding, and it was ready to go. The final page in an old library. Here we see some books that have been chained to their shelves. After going through all that work, they've reached their final form and are ready to be read. And that is where the book ends. No special focus on one particular manuscript or any topic in manuscripts, just a wide variety of different tasks that go into creating a manuscript for the medieval world. This is an older book, as I've already mentioned. It was published in 1992, so quite a bit older, but I think it was a perfect book to fill that niche and how these manuscripts were actually created. I learned so much from this book, and while I think maybe new stuff may have been discovered since 30 years ago, it doesn't negate the quality of this book. It's the right length. We're not going 300, 400 pages into academic, detailed deep dive, which has a role, but not for me. It's the right length to give me the introduction that I need to appreciate these other manuscripts. There is a section for further reading in the back, and normally I do like to look at these to get more ideas. The one thing I would mind when looking at this is, while I'm sure all the books mentioned here are interesting and fantastic, I also have to imagine in 30 years, other books have been published that I may want to read as well. So the further reading might need to be filled in by some other additional research online if you want to do additional reading from this book. But if you're just looking for a basic primer on how these medieval manuscripts were created, I think this is actually a fantastic book. Disregard the age. In fact, maybe the age is a plus. Maybe you can get it for a great discount online. Medieval Craftsmen, Scribes and Illuminators was a really interesting book. It also makes me wonder if Medieval Craftsmen is a series, and there's other interesting books that I can get from this series that talk about different artists and different craftsmen from the medieval time and the way they contributed to society and the way scribes and illuminators did. If you've read this book or have any thoughts or comments, please leave your thoughts and comments in the comment section down below. I love to receive it. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.